Imagine waking up one day to find 38 cabins built on your land. Cabins you never approved, cabins you didn't even know existed until you looked closer. That's exactly what happened to me. And what started as a small discovery quickly turned into one of the biggest property disputes you could ever imagine. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. How could an entire homeowners association decide to use my land without even asking? But the deeper I looked, the more shocking the truth became. They had not only built on my property, but they were renting and selling those cabins as if the land belonged to them. For a while, I stayed quiet, just observing. I watched families move in, watched the HOA board act like they ran the place, and watched money exchange hands, all on property I legally owned. The arrogance of it was unbelievable. They thought no one would notice. They thought no one would challenge them. But what they didn't realize was that every single cabin, every single deal, and every single dollar tied back to my land title. So, I decided to take action, not with anger, but with the law on my side. It wasn't just about proving ownership, it was about showing what happens when people overstep their boundaries and think they can take what isn't theirs. And let's just say, the outcome was something none of them saw coming. Because when you build 38 cabins on someone else's property without permission, you better be ready for the day the real owner shows up. And that's exactly where this story takes a turn you won't believe, where those homes, their hard work, and even their so-called investments suddenly became mine. But how did it all unfold? Stay tuned. The strange part is, this whole mess didn't start overnight. For years, the land sat quiet, tucked away just outside the town. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine, paid for fair and square, with the deed locked safely in my name. I didn't live on it full-time, but I checked in often enough to know its boundaries. That's why when I first saw the cabins, I thought maybe I had wandered into the wrong spot. But as I walked further, the truth hit me. These buildings were standing right where my property markers had always been. I started digging into how this could have happened, and that's when the pieces started coming together. The local homeowners association had been expanding, taking on new projects, and advertising what they called a private community retreat. They talked about building rental cabins, creating passive income, and attracting families who wanted a peaceful escape. But the land they used for this grand plan wasn't theirs, it was mine. They must have assumed that since I wasn't around all the time, no one would notice. Or worse, maybe they thought I wouldn't care. As I walked through the rows of cabins, I noticed how well-kept everything was. Porch lights, trimmed lawns, even mailboxes with numbers neatly painted on. Families waved at me like I belonged there. Kids played in the dirt roads, running between cabins that technically stood on stolen ground. The HOA board members strutted around like they owned the whole development, welcoming newcomers, collecting fees, and making promises about future improvements. The more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. They had built an entire community on land that was never theirs to begin with. And every smile, every cabin, every deal they made only made the knot in my chest tighter. They had no idea what was coming. At first, I tried to convince myself there had to be some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA had leased land nearby and simply built too far over the line. But when I went to the county records office, the truth became impossible to ignore. The survey maps were crystal clear. The cabins, the roads, even the so-called community center all sat squarely on my property. My name was on the title, not theirs. And yet, the HOA had been collecting thousands in fees, selling memberships, and even advertising ownership opportunities on something that legally never belonged to them. What made it worse was how bold they had become. I heard board members talking about expansion, plans for even more cabins, a clubhouse, maybe even a pool. It was almost surreal, watching them draw up big dreams on land that I could reclaim with a single legal notice. But I didn't move too quickly. I wanted to see just how far they had gone. The deeper I looked, the bigger the mess became. Neighbors who had bought into the community started telling me stories. Some had sunk their life savings into these cabins, thinking they owned them outright. Others paid monthly fees to the HOA, believing they were investing in shared property. And while I sympathized with the families caught in the middle, I couldn't ignore the fact that the HOA had knowingly crossed the line. They weren't just bending rules, They had built an empire on land they didn't own. That's when the real conflict began to take shape. It wasn't just me against an overreaching HOA. It was me against a system of false promises, misplaced trust, and people who thought they were untouchable. And the question hung in the air: how far would they go to keep their so-called community alive once the truth came out? The turning point came the day I finally confronted the HOA board. I walked into one of their community meetings, a gathering where they usually welcomed new cabin owners and collected dues. The room went quiet when I introduced myself, not as a guest or potential buyer, but as the legal owner of the land they were all standing on. At first, they laughed it off, thinking I was bluffing. But when I laid the property documents on the table, the laughter faded fast. Faces shifted from smug confidence to pale disbelief. Some board members stammered excuses about paperwork mix-ups, while others grew defensive, insisting they had every right to build there. The cabin owners in the room looked around nervously, suddenly realizing their investments weren't as secure as they had believed. Whispers spread through the crowd. Words like fraud, lawsuit, and eviction hung heavy in the air. What struck me most was how bold the board still tried to be. They claimed I had no proof, that I couldn't possibly win against a whole community. But they underestimated one thing: my patience and the undeniable trail of evidence. I had every survey, every county record, every legal detail lined up. The cabins weren't just sitting on borrowed ground. They were sitting on stolen ground. That night, as I left the meeting, I could feel the tension building like a storm. Families peered out from porches, worried about their futures. Board members huddled together, plotting their next move. And me? I walked away knowing the showdown was inevitable. The HOA had built their empire on land that wasn't theirs, and now they were standing on the edge of losing everything. The question wasn't if it would all come crashing down, but when and how hard. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more complicated, a new twist surfaced, one that changed everything. A week after the tense community meeting, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The HOA had filed paperwork claiming they were the rightful owners of the land, presenting a set of documents they insisted prove their case. At first glance, the papers looked convincing, filled with legal jargon, seals, and signatures. But something felt off. I had held the original deed for years, and I knew there was no way they could have a legitimate claim. The discovery sent me down another path. Were they bold enough to forge documents? Or had they found a loophole buried in old county filings? I rushed back to the records office, and sure enough, the clerk pulled out files that showed a mysterious transfer attempt filed not long after the cabins were built. Someone had tried to slide the land under the HOA's name, banking on the idea that I wouldn't notice. It was sloppy, but it showed just how far they were willing to go to protect their empire. What made matters worse was how the community reacted once word got out. Cabin owners split into two camps. Some sided with me, admitting they felt misled and betrayed by the HOA. Others stood firmly with the board, convinced I was the villain trying to strip them of their homes. Tensions flared. Neighbors argued in the streets, and the so-called peaceful retreat turned into a battleground of mistrust. I realized then that this wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, loyalty, and survival. The HOA wasn't backing down, and now the fight wasn't just in the courts, it was spilling into the community itself. And the real showdown was only beginning. The battle reached its peak in the courtroom. The HOA board walked in with their lawyers, stacks of papers, and an air of confidence, as if they had already won. Cabin owners filled the seats behind them, some anxious, some defiant, waiting to see whose future would collapse that day. I sat quietly with my own attorney, holding the original deed, the one piece of evidence that would decide everything. When the judge called for proof of ownership, the HOA presented their so-called documents. At first, they looked polished, even professional, but as my lawyer began to question their validity, the cracks showed. Dates didn't line up. Signatures didn't match. And one critical county seal turned out to be nothing more than a stamp from a local print shop. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs spread. The HOA's confidence began to crumble in real time. Then came our turn. My lawyer placed the original deed on the table, along with years of tax receipts, survey maps, and filings that tied the land to my name, without a single gap. The judge reviewed the documents carefully before looking up and delivering the words that ended the dispute. The land was mine, beyond any doubt. Every cabin, every structure, every promise the HOA had made was built on property they never owned. Gasps filled the room as the verdict sank in. Families realized their investments now legally belonged to me, and the HOA board sat frozen, stripped of the authority they had clung to for so long. But just when I thought the fight was over, the final twist came. A developer approached me right outside the courthouse, offering to buy the entire property, including all 38 cabins, for a staggering price. Suddenly, what started as a battle over stolen land turned into a decision that could change my future forever. Standing outside the courthouse with that offer on the table, I felt the weight of everything that had happened. For months, the HOA had treated me like I was invisible, using my land as if it were theirs. Families had moved into cabins built on ground they never truly owned, and the board had lied to everyone, hoping their empire would stand unchallenged. Now the truth was out, the law was clear, and the choice of what came next was mine. The developer's proposal was tempting. With one signature, I could sell the land, the cabins, and every problem tied to them for a price that would secure my future. But as I looked around at the faces of the families who had been caught in the middle, I couldn't ignore the human side of the story. Many of them had been misled, losing savings and trust because of the HOA's false promises. They weren't my enemies, they were victims of the same scheme. So instead of rushing into a deal, I took time to think. In the end, I decided to work out a fair arrangement. Some families could purchase their cabins properly from me at a fair price, others chose to leave, and the developer still took interest in the remaining lots. The HOA board, on the other hand, faced the consequences of their actions, both in court and in the eyes of the community they had betrayed. Looking back, the fight wasn't just about land, it was about standing up for what was right. Property ownership, honesty, and accountability matter, no matter how big or small the dispute. In the end, I walked away not only with justice, but with the peace of knowing that no one could ever take advantage of my land again.